The Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Planted. This is our, what is it? I think this is our 33rd episode. It's our 32nd or 33rd episode. I've got to check it out. Time goes by so fast. But today we have Celia Carter from Roshi. I'm really excited to have her on today. She is the co-founder and CEO of Roshi. Roshi is a supply chain management and compliance platform built for cannabis. She's leveraging her experience in and the sophistication of supply chain solutions for FDA-regulated products of cannabis. Celia is one of these people who has come from healthcare into the cannabis space. She spent 6+ years as the director of operations at Bracket Global, where she oversaw the clinical trial supply chain, logistics, and patient management technology business units, global operations. In her role, she prepared the business unit operationally and financially for acquisition by Medco Health Solutions. Throughout her 15+ year career, Celia has built strategic partnerships between life science and technology companies, most recently as part of a corporate development and partnerships team at Google X Life Sciences, and previously at Global Head Healthcare Technologies and Innovation Office at Genentech. She holds a BA degree from UC California, Berkeley, and an MBA at UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. I just actually did part of a lecture series last fall with the MBA students, and they were wonderful. Welcome. I'm so glad to have you here, Celia.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Yes.
Yeah.
There's a big, rich culture of cannabis at Berkeley and Berkeley Haas that I've been tied to. So it's been a great support network, and they're doing great things out of there.
Yeah, I really have been loving what they've been doing with the series that they just have for the MBA students, and then all the work that the students have done on SheCan. I think that's it's a great, rich thing for curriculum, but it also really prepares people for, if they're interested in getting into cannabis out of school, to kind of wet their feet in the space.
Yes, absolutely. And that's something that, at least when I was there trying to say, hey, aren't you guys interested in cannabis? Doesn't anybody want to start a business? It was still sort of in the early days. So it's great to see that come full circle.
Yeah, it's really cool. And when I was looking at your bio and I was noticing Genentech and stuff like that, my mom is, she's since retired, but she's a cancer researcher. So she did a lot of work with Genentech and some of the other biotech companies. And I'm finding that it's fascinating too how some of the companies are starting to look at some of the cannabinoids and synthesized cannabinoids in particular. I'm excited to see what comes out of that, but I'm also hoping that everybody kind of goes back to full spectrum plant-based cannabinoid science.
Yeah, we definitely, we have a lot to learn here. I mentioned that I come from a background in clinical research and patient engagement technologies. And, one key piece of that is starting to understand personalized medicine, right? So that's a hot topic when we think about what's happening in clinical research. What are the different, triggers and, for a particular person's biology. And I think, that's something that I'm super interested in when we start looking at cannabis is, there's so much rich data out there around patient-reported outcomes that we just really haven't collected yet.
Yeah. That's one thing that I've noticed, research is a wonderful thing. We have all these stories from patients about their experiences as well. Like when people come to my classes, I always tell them, you can look at research, you can read a great educational text on cannabis, you can come to my classes, but what you're getting is a report back on how the majority of human beings respond to cannabis, and we're walking
Right.
chemistry experiments. And I'm really excited to see, when we look at before, when there weren't as many people using cannabis and we weren't getting as many reports back because people were a little bit more private about their impressions, we would see these anomalies that would pop up from time to time, like sensitivities to CBD. And we're just like, oh, well, that's, one in a great while. But as we pick up and more people are starting to use it, we're finding that some of these anomalies, it may be a smaller portion of the population, but it's more than we thought it was because more people are using it and reporting back.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, the key for the cannabis industry is to start. I know that there's companies looking at capturing, customer feedback through different online e-commerce solutions, but really, I'm interested in looking at validated scientific scales when it comes to collecting this patient information. And so if you look at, the execution of clinical trials and trying to relate some of those data points back to efficacy, the ways that we actually construct surveys and feedback from people, really influences the scientific rigor around that data.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's for sure. As when I went to school, I did training in statistics and research methodologies, and it was really interesting to dig in. And I have to admit, I came from a hippie college. I came from the California Institute of Integral Studies, so we also talked about like the decolonization of research as well, which I thought was
Right.
a really interesting point, because we have for so long seen research through a certain lens, and I'm really excited to see, as we start to deepen our and decolonize our methodologies, what that's going to look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of circling back for, me getting into this industry and a bit, about Roshi, I mean, the patient-driven aspect is really, how Roshi came to be. So, just I guess a bit about that entry. One of our co-founders, her husband's actually the founder of the Apothecarium. I know that you know that.
Oh, yeah.
And, it was there that, working with him and understanding kind of those patient interactions is, getting those oncology patients that would come into the Apothecarium in the 215 days and, get guided towards certain products, depend on them and then have stocking issues, right? So they would come in, they tried, an 18-to-1 pen for the first time or something like that, come back in for that, and it wasn't there, right? And so that's really the impetus for how are we going to better the supply chain to ensure that, those medications are there and that resupply is, ahead of the curve.
Yeah, it's really essential that we have that, because not only do they need it, but it's also very emotional, especially when you're going through something, to have something that you count on not being available.
Right. So yeah, so that's kind of, what Roshi is all about in terms of trying to solve those stockouts.
So I want to back it up pre-Roshi. I always like to ask my
Yeah.
guests what your first cannabis experience was like.
Sure. So, I mean, I feel like my first, let's just talk more about exposure to cannabis. Totally outing my brother, but if anybody knows him, that's totally okay. I was probably in like 7th grade, and he's 2 years older than me, so he's maybe a freshman in high school. And he and his friends used to smoke weed in the basement, and it would come right up through the vents in my room. So that's my first, personal, exposure. So it wasn't something that I was, doing myself at that time. But that's kind of like, he sort of exposed me to the powers of that smell, right, coming through the vents. And, it wasn't for a couple of years later until I would actually, start to use cannabis. And over time, I've actually become one of the, the Cali sober folks. So being of Asian descent, I'm actually, I've got that special allergic reaction to alcohol.
Oh, that's no fun.
Yeah. So, quickly finding through high school, through college, and all that time that, we all have our ways, and cannabis just fits, much better with my biology than alcohol does.
Yeah, I like it much more too. I'll have like we enjoy wine from time to time, but when I was going through chemo, you don't really, it's not that I couldn't drink, but you don't have any desire to, because you already feel kind of gross. And then afterwards, I just found that using cannabis, I felt better. Like I don't really have a need for getting like a little loose with alcohol, because the next day I just feel a little dehydrated, a little tired. And at my age, water retention, like my mother told me that was going to happen eventually, and then it did. you know. Well, how did you decide after, having a rich career in biotech to do the switch to cannabis?
Yeah, so that was, I had went back to, so I was at Genentech for about 7 years in digital health and technology. I had just landed I went back to school and got my MBA part-time while I was working at Genentech, and was ready to kind of move on to something new after being there for quite some time. And so I probably got what every MBA's dream is a corporate development job at, Google Life Science. A lot of my classmates sort of died for that type of job. And I, dove into it for about 4 months. And it was then that my co-founder Heidi and my co-founder Jason tapped me on the shoulder and said, we really want to bring what we did for pharma to the cannabis industry. Do you want to be a part of this? And I, had the entrepreneurial itch. I went back to school to focus on entrepreneurship. And so it was really the perfect opportunity to tie in my background in supply chain for pharmaceuticals, an interest in the cannabis industry and this entrepreneurial nature altogether. And so I just, decided, I didn't moonlight. I sort of just decided, let's make this happen, and went full steam ahead in the beginning of 2018 is when we sort of started to put the company together.
That's awesome. It's funny. It's like we were talking for a brief moment before we started to record, and I was mentioning to you that when I saw that, and I knew Heidi was working on this software, but I hadn't really thought about it until you and I were going to be talking. And I just remember when we were looking at legalization happening, and people were nervous about it and thinking that it would just be an opportunity for people to, it's amazing how people always have the worst case scenario, people will just not do anything and smoke lots of
Yep.
weed. And I was like, you don't understand, legitimizing this industry brings so many jobs and skills to the table. And one of the things I would always say is, do you know how many young people are going to be interested in supply chain management now? And what a good thing that is.
Exactly. No, I mean, I think, I do a lot of panels of MBA students and, getting them excited about the opportunities, careers. I think there's kind of twofold that's unraveling in the industry. One is that all the traditional jobs, whether it be in technology or CPG or, depending on what or retail, a lot of those jobs that are sort of common jobs that we understand, can be applied to the cannabis industry. And we're seeing lots of big, C-suite hires coming from, Fortune 500 companies into the cannabis space. But I also think it sort of spurred these roles that we didn't even imagine, right? So when I think about my own career trajectory and getting into digital health wasn't a thing when I graduated, from college, in 2000, so it didn't evolve into kind of a career path and being niche until then. And I see the same thing happening in cannabis. You look at compliance and metrics. I mean, there's certainly, compliance at other organizations, but it's a different lens here. Being a metric specialist and an inventory manager for cannabis is actually a career path.
It is, and you almost have to be part wizard to navigate it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not about just even, expanding the roles that we already know, but it's, creating new niche jobs that didn't exist before.
Yeah, I think that's really exciting. And not only is it creating new jobs, but I love the fact that it's engaging people, because one of the things that I found is if you find somebody who loves what they're working with and what they're doing, there's constant growth. You have somebody who's always looking to innovate, because engagement is key, right?
Yeah.
It's exciting. And I think that, when you think about how many jobs have been created by the cannabis industry and are still yet to be created, I just really hope that from a policy standpoint, we're able to start straightening some things out so that it's much more sustainable and we can grow even more.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, it's the combination, like I mentioned, of just getting that more exposure through schools, and, we're putting an academic lens on it. We're also, there's scientific aspects, and then there's just corporate, and all of those things kind of help, normalize cannabis, so to speak, or open it up to, people to understand that it could be a career choice.
Right. And I think too, when, because we do have legacy operators and we have people who are in this because they really, enjoy cannabis and they're passionate about that. But I think this is a great opportunity for us to learn how to do business in a different way. Much how, and I know I've said this dozens of times, much how the tech industry changed the way we did business outside of tech. I think that we can be looking at cannabis to change the way we do business, even like from a perspective of being more, how would you say it, compassionate capitalism. So, there's abundance on all sides, and we can actually use this. Not that it's a panacea or a Band-Aid for all of our social woes, but it could definitely support our communities, and we can look at just how we can give back to our communities and support them. And in turn, that creates a healthy industry too.
Yeah, and I think that's, I know that, from my exposure, at least from the early days, you saw a lot of those legacy operators, having philanthropic objectives, weaved into their missions, right? And so being able to continue to maintain those. And I think, it's a good point. One of our ethos, at least as a business, has been, large scale ERP supply chain management solutions can be $250,000 plus to build. And so by nature, you're making those available to those with loads of access to capital. And so, we've been of the thought that because our platform is SaaS-based, we are giving, a democratic or democratizing access to powerful software. It doesn't have to be $250,000, but we do believe that having a technology solution will give smaller brands and businesses the infrastructure they need to actually compete with those that do have the $250,000 systems. That's
very important, because the cost of entrance to this industry has become crazy, and that's also why we're seeing equity programs need so much more support, and a product like yours could really help equity operators get a leg up.
Yep.
Let's talk about your product more. Would you describe what Roshi is, and you talked a little bit about why the three of you thought to put it together, but if we could do a little bit more in depth on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Roshi is an inventory management compliance platform at the core. And so those are really our core competencies when you look at, where we're coming from in managing a regulated supply chain, as well, in a compliant way. And so we're really fusing those two components together. We started our company focused on manufacturing and distribution. And the reason why is because we felt as though, the counts of inventory at the retail location were only as good as what was happening downstream in the supply chain, right? So if a retail store says, we need more of this, that's great, but is everything downstream in place so that we can, provide that resupply? So currently our platform is focused on manufacturing and distribution. We recently actually launched our cultivation module. So now we are supporting all three verticals, pre-retail on our platform. So at the core, brands, manufacturers, distributors, cultivators are using our platform to track their operations, track all of the data related to it, as well as, manage all of their metric compliance and state regulatory requirements. What I'm most excited about is, how we're differentiating ourselves. I think you look at other, seed to sale providers are kind of checking that metric box, and, going back to why did we start this, we're really looking at how do we connect this fragmented supply chain and automate shipments between brands and retailers. And so that's really, the next step of evolution from our platform.
That's really important. How does that work with point of sale in retail establishments, or does that?
Yeah, it does. Well, it does and it doesn't. So, all these retailers are using different point of sale solutions. And so, as a brand, in order to get data back with respect to your particular brand, you need to be able to tap into those point of sale solutions. We're currently in a state where we have the ability to also look at, APIs that hold a lot of that data. So that's, the different metric state regulatory systems. And so that's exactly what we're doing. We are looking at retail velocity information real time, looking at tying that back directly to a brand that's on our platform to establish when they're actually running out. So a lot of that is opening things up from a retail perspective to say, I'm willing to share these things with my brand in terms of, how fast their SKU is selling, so that I can better my supply chain with them. And, we're seeing that happen with retailers. I think in the past, everybody's been like, no, I don't want to show you my data. But really, isolating it to say, for example, I'll say Key Coco, they're on our platform. And so, it can be that the retail location says, I already know kind of, how much I need. I want to get on auto ordering with Key Coco, and they're on the Roshi platform, and we can do that.
That's awesome. I feel like, Key Coco is a really great example. I love Amanda. And they're a really great example of like a professionally run cannabis company. Like they just really saw things ahead of time, what they needed to do to keep up to speed. When we're looking at systems like Metric, I've been hearing more about certain states not actually wanting to work with the software because of some of the issues that they've seen us encountering, like in states like where we are in California. What have you noticed about that? And I'm going to preface it with this is not going to be my knocking of Metric, although I see a lot of people loving doing that.
There's enough forums for that. We don't need to take over the podcast.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a challenge. It goes through peaks and valleys. I mean, you look at so the benefits of our platform go beyond Metric, right? We certainly do that. And the actual, behind the scenes of what Metric's trying to achieve from a traceability perspective can be understood, right? So I don't think that like the idea of track and trace or having that level of traceability is something that people can't get behind. One thing that's very unique, though, in this industry, when you look at others that are evolving, is that most of those systems, like when you look at the pharmaceutical, it's not that you're tying into a centralized system every time you're transacting. Really, what you have is you have your internal controls such that you could be audited and and can demonstrate the traceability, right? And so, I'm not for or against actually, like centralization, but if you look at other industries, not everybody has, the single provider that everybody's, obviously cannabis is nuanced, but, that's not how it works in other industries. Like even look at nutraceuticals, it's not like everybody, taps into single thing. It's just that we all have traceability mechanisms built into our organization. Auditors can see that we have it, and it's okay if it's not the same system.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at some of the things that we have in cannabis that are unique to the industry. And, some of them seem to go a little overboard, but then some of them almost seem like, maybe there's a middle ground because, a lot of people say, well, we don't have to do this in other industries. Well, in some cases, I think other industries almost need to step up their game a little bit, but maybe not go as far as we've had to,
Right. Well, we always say, like, do I know where that tomato came from in my tomato soup, right?
Yeah, that's it. Because, even with like the testing and everything that we have to do, it's more stringent than what we have to do for organic produce.
Right. And I like the way you phrase that, though, because is it really the wrong thing? No, it's the right thing to be testing cannabis products,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's such a good thing to be able to do it. It would just be really nice if we could have more of a middle ground and have it so that it wasn't, because I know like when we got into legalization and the prices of cannabis went way up, people were really upset. And the first thing they wanted to do was blame the dispensary, and then the second thing they wanted to do was blame the products. And what we've really had to do is like lay it out for people, because it's just a knee-jerk reaction. It's emotional reaction, which is totally understandable. But explaining to them everything that's baked into the price of that product, it's like, no, it's not just the manufacturing of the product. It's paying for testing. It's paying for, everything that they had to do to be able to establish their business, all the environmental testing and everything, the licensing, our
Right.
very expensive packaging, and then that lovely excise tax.
Right. Yeah. And so at the end of the day, all the, mouths that are fed along the way, right? Until the
Right.
end, it's not a huge margin business. And yeah, no, it is interesting to talk to, and I'm sure you did from, your experience on retail, is like talking to people from the outside who just really don't see it that way, right? They
Right.
don't understand like all the back end to it, when it's like, all I know is I went in for like one thing and I came out with a $75 bill,
That's it. Well, I always joke that when I used to teach my cannabis classes at City, I was like, I should add another module called Economics and Civics for
Yeah.
Stoners.
Yeah.
Let's really
Yeah.
deconstruct why this is the way it is.
Yeah.
A few weeks ago, I was in the Americans for Safe Access meeting, and we were discussing the MORE Act. And one of the things that I found really interesting is, when I travel and lecture throughout the states, especially in areas where they're still putting together their policies, I've noticed that policy isn't necessarily based on fact. It's based on state culture, which is very strong and very rich. That's a reality, and also stigma. And when we're looking at the MORE Act, one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of the language, even though we're getting support from members of the Senate and the House, we're also looking at language that's still reflecting a lot of the stigma. For example, and I thought that this was interesting from a supply chain management perspective, one of the things that I noticed was, of course, there's going to be federal taxation. That's a given. But products that may have been stolen from a business, unless they can prove beyond a benefit of the doubt that it wasn't due to negligence from the ownership or the staff, they're still on the hook for taxes for that lost product.
Interesting.
I thought that was
Yeah.
really interesting, and I'm just wondering, like, what your thoughts are on just like the differences between that and other industries. And I'm sorry, I might be putting you on the spot a little bit. But like, what would you say to that? What are your thoughts about just kind of just how do you think that we're going to start seeing changes with how business leaders in the industry are being treated around this, or do you think that we have a ways to go before we're not treated like the corner drug dealers that are trying to get out of paying our taxes?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the key is kind of these bigger initiatives or, government acts that kind of open doors, right? So when you think about like banking access and what does that automatically legitimize for people? So I do think that there's a big policy aspect in terms of influencing how everybody else thinks about the industry. For some reason, as soon as that becomes reality, everybody's on board, right? Or like we have to, have that government act. I think we're a ways away, though. I think what's difficult for me, even as a business owner, selling to these operators, is that our operator base is so diverse. And so just some things that you were even saying around, the taxes and what kind of margins people are actually holding, there's so much more that goes into that, right? So you have like a standalone operator who is only doing manufacturing in their brand versus somebody who's vertically integrated, and what does that mean for their supply chain, how they can move money throughout their organization effectively, and things like that. I think we're kind of speaking to, when we say like cannabis operators and people who are license holders, it's so different. And so I always like to call that out, it presents interesting challenges from my side when we're selling to, a mom and pop shop versus, a large MSO.
Yeah, yeah, that is true. And then there's just people who want to be working in the industry, but they can't even deal with all of that. And so they end up going and working in the legacy market. And that's,
Right.
I just saw this article the other day that was like, will legalization, get, impact the legacy market? And they think that they're talking about it going away. And I'm like, absolutely, it's going to affect it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean it's going to go away, as we've seen in
Right.
California, because, when we were looking at policies pre-legalization, I was, talking to people saying, why are we reinventing the wheel? Why aren't we looking at what other states are doing and what's worked and what hasn't? And every state reinvents the wheel, which creates this really awkward time where more people start going back to the legacy market. And there's a lot of really talented people involved in it. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually give them the opportunity to not have to work in the shadows?
Yeah, exactly. And it's a pretty healthy market, it's not
Yeah.
small.
No.
And, little levers in policy really can influence that decision, right? So every little, the way that things are structured, people will construct and, it makes it just non-advantageous to be here.
Yeah, it does. And we had conversations when we were first talking about equity programs. And one of the things, and I know it seems very simplistic and idealistic, but I was like, how about when somebody gets busted for selling without a permit or license, that we give them a leaflet that shows them how to go legit? There's just
Yeah.
like, let's support people instead of creating this friction and furthering the stigma. But
Yeah.
even when we're looking at like non-plant touching businesses in the cannabis space, there are so many issues. Like, for example, I'm a educator, and when I teach at colleges and universities, I have to have professional liability insurance. I have to show
Right.
that to them. And like just the other year, my carrier told me that I was no longer going to be able to have the same insurance that I was. They dropped me because I'm a cannabis educator, even though I don't sell the plant. There's no plant
Yeah.
touching during my classes. Have you experienced any sort of challenges around that just as a business?
Oh, certainly. And I think, coming in, I think that's what, one of the most difficult things, there's twofold. One is, I went to business school, but they don't actually teach you how to start out, and certainly not how to navigate, the cannabis situation. But a lot of it is, which makes it difficult to enter the space, is that you have to do so much research on yourself. There's no handbook for how to go about these things. And, coming from outside the industry and entering in, I was like, I don't know what how do I navigate this? What is allowed? When should, who should I go to? Do I need specialized insurance, or can I just go to any insurance broker? So a lot of those questions have come up. I think things have changed over time, even just in the last, 3 years, but certainly some of the same, banking challenges, insurance challenges, came up for us as well, to say, hey, we don't actually touch the plant, and because, like you were saying, life insurance becomes an issue because they're like, are you handling lots of cash, and people are going to want to kill you, and, all of that. So.
Yeah, it's I think it's really interesting, just the assumptions that are made. And I think well, one of the things, like going back to, my Stoner Civics 101 class that I'd like to have, as one of the things that I've been really trying to do with people throughout, my career in cannabis, but especially this year, I've been really wanting to have more conversations and really push this is, I think one of the things when we're looking at cannabis policy and things evening out and having us actually be treated like legitimate businesses is pressure from the public. When people get frustrated about, how things are looking, I always say, you're not powerless in this. You have a voice. Our policymakers and people who depend on our votes to actually keep their jobs, it's time for us to step up as citizens and let them know that, we're responsible. We have jobs. We take part in society. We pay our taxes. We use cannabis, and we vote.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. Contributing members of society, right?
Exactly, because I really feel like in a lot of ways, these policies are made because they feel like the people that they impact the most won't care because we're too busy just hanging out at home, smoking a bowl, eating flaming hot Cheetos.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that at this point we know how much, lobbying and advocacy, how much there actually is going on in the cannabis industry and, really in tune. But I continue to be just, not surprised, but just impressed by, the caliber of the business people that are running these cannabis businesses through all of the challenges, right? So I kind of think about this when I think about being a woman in leadership. So being a woman in leadership, they're like, you have to be 10 times better than the guy next to you.
You do.
Right? Like you actually, and you are. So you're like a rock star and you're 10 times better. And I kind of think about that when you think about cannabis business, like they don't have banking, insurance is hard. They don't know, the regulations and kind of just all of that. Like if you have all of those battle scars, imagine just running a company without any of that.
Wow, wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah. So like how successful and impactful would some of these leaders, be outside of this industry in itself? So
Yeah. And without some of these parameters that are just creating more issues than they are actually helping, like how many more people we'd be able to employ and how much more we'd be able to grow our businesses if we didn't have these things holding us back that don't hold back other industries.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. God, there was something what was I going to ask you? We were talking about that. Well, when you were looking at the space and when you're looking at like the sphere that you're working in, what are some things that you've noticed that you'd like to change, and how would you like to change them?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, just some of the things, of course, I'm looking at just, a technology lens, at least for the first pass here. One of the things that I saw early, and I continue to see, although it's hopefully changing a bit, and I mentioned this earlier, is just because this industry is not, especially in the cannabis space or tech space, is not yet well defined. I think a lot of us tech companies, and I'll include myself, are still figuring out, the landscape of technology. And so, probably yourself, since you're not, knee deep in the technology, the same way. It's like, oh, I heard about Dutchie. Oh, I heard about this company. It's like, how does that all fit into the cannabis technology architecture? What does that look like? Mm-hmm. And so the lanes aren't established quite yet. So one company who's doing seed to sale, their ultimate goal may actually be to be a marketplace and compete with LeafLink, but they're not yet, right? And so there's still kind of an evolution happening. If you look at clinical trial execution in the digital health space, it's growing, but it started to form like, what kind of company are you? Are you medication adherence? Are you patient education? Like, what are you going after in terms of your solution? And so what that establishes is more best-in-class solutions that integrate into kind of an overall technology ecosystem versus these jack-of-all-trades. And so I see a lot of companies getting forced in the cannabis space into solving every problem because they don't know where to stop. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that operators are currently looking for one-stop shops versus what would the world look like with integrated solutions that were best-in-class put together.
Yeah.
That's something I want to happen. I want to play nice with other technology providers that do other things that could utilize my data for a good experience for our shared customer, versus me trying to do everything, and displace every other type of technology out there.
Right. And when you're mentioning data, you were talking earlier about people not wanting to let go of their data because, it's money.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things that I've always been curious about, because we get, we have these data groups in cannabis that put out all these reports about trends and different things.
Yeah.
How, and I've always just kind of looked at it kind of with a side eye because I'm like, yeah, but how many people are really letting loose their data so you're able to look at what they're doing? Like
Yeah.
how accurate are these reports? And what are you seeing as far as like people loosening up and actually letting their data show so that as an industry we can strengthen ourselves and better what we do?
Yeah, so I don't know tons and tons about the sources of different data. Everybody's like, oh, this is why my data is better, right? There's a couple like those macro, subscriptions that you can get. Mm-hmm. So I can't speak too much to that accuracy. I do know that at least, probably been a good 18 months when I went to an operator and they're like, yeah, that's not how much money I made this month at all. Like when they looked at that report. So, I know that there are issues with it. I think that early on there's some jaded operators on people that were really about a data play, and so I think everybody's had been super on edge about like, oh, you just want my data. And it's like, what do I want to use your data for? We've always been from day one because we knew about the sensitivity. We're like, you own your data. We don't own your data. That's very clear. What companies like mine are interested are rolling up macro level de-identified data, right? And that's, we're not trying to capture data of a certain, let's say, extractor because they have some proprietary IP, which we have contracts with them that we could never share anyway, that we want to share with everybody this like proprietary way that they do extraction. That's not the objective. We don't want to use it at all. I think what people are trying to understand is across, our 500 customers, when using CO2, we see this versus when butane, we see this, and kind of making completely de-identified generalizations about whether it's manufacturing operations or otherwise. And so maybe I'm only speaking for myself. I feel like I'm so good-hearted in like the direction that we're trying to go with it. But I think, there's just a fear, but I don't think that anybody's data standalone is like all that valuable until you get a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first I want to thank you for being a good player in that because, there are people who do like to, take data and manipulate it and do different things with it. I mean, we've even seen with like genetics, with like the whole Phylos debacle and everything, that was just a total mess. But when we're looking at things like this, like, do you think that, how would I say this? Do you think that a lot of this, because what I was wondering is the shift, because we were very Wild West, especially in the 215 days leading up to legalization. Yep. Everybody was kind of an island onto themselves. And, it's very much like low key, kind of like snitches get stitches kind of thing. But now that we're having people who are coming in from large companies who understand like what's going on with that data and why it's so important to share it, do you think that we're getting a lot more openness because we are having professionals come in who understand the gravity of it and also the parameters around sharing data?
Yeah, and yeah, I do. I see it. I definitely see a big change since 2018 when we were doing discovery visits and starting to understand. Keep in mind, right? As you know, most of these operators that we were going to visit in 2018, which was even like Metric wasn't even live yet, and we weren't in the true rec market, they didn't want to write anything down. You didn't want a paper trail,
Yeah.
Like, you didn't want a paper trail. You didn't want a digital trail for certain of all the inventory you have and everything, right? So for us coming in even, now we're talking 3 years ago, sharing data was like, number one, I don't want anybody to have this record of what I'm doing. And now all of a sudden I have to put every single transaction I'm doing in here. So that's kind of, people were coming from a very protected state. And then when you're dealing with products, I think there's a feeling that the product is what you're selling. So that's your IP. And so we get into those conversations a lot of, part of our process, of course, is to configure extraction and production workflows and recipes. And so we hold a lot of IP of, brands out there. And so getting them behind, like, no, we can't do anything with this in comfort, and that there's language contractually to make them feel comfortable with that, is something, we still have to have a conversation on all the time.
Yeah, yeah. I can only imagine, especially because back when things were Wild West, there were a lot of people who ended up getting double crossed on, their trade secrets and things like that. Because
Exactly. Yeah. I heard a lot of people saying, I've seen my product produced by somebody else in a bigger brand.
Right. Well, and that's one of the great things about regulation legalization is that there will be more protections around that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, protections, especially for the smaller players, because I think that's when it becomes difficult to defend.
Yeah. And when we're talking about smaller players, with all the companies that you're working with and the way policy is moving, do you think that there's room for MSOs and small players, like, and especially when we're looking at like smaller dispensaries or maybe even like small artisan growers, because it would be a shame to see them go away. They're such a rich part of our work.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest challenge is going to be working out the economics. Like I mentioned earlier, when you have your supply chain locked in and, the cost and the way the money is flowing is only through your own organization, I think that's going to be the biggest question is, what kind of capital constraints and margins can smaller businesses withstand? I think you look at California from a consumer market, I think, I still think that there's a big market for, smaller operators, small batch, et cetera. That's just who we are, right? In Northern California, at least. So I think that'll be quite some time. It's just, can it economically work out? That's why we're trying to support smaller operators on our platform. And the big key there is that if it doesn't work out, the companies that, may get acquired, if that's the ultimate exit for some of these smaller operators, is having, your infrastructure and data really tight.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of some of the things we tell them. So not only does it help you operate against these large players by having some infrastructure behind your business, but you become a much better target if acquisition is your end goal, because your financials are all lined up. They know your inventory. They can see your sales history. It's like wrapping up a package for them to look at.
Yeah. Due diligence is daunting no matter what industry you're in, but
Right.
It sure is a shock for people who have been, making sure that there is no paper trail.
Yeah, exactly.
When we're looking at the industry, what are you seeing? What are your hypothesis for the future with our models, and what do you hope to see?
Yeah, I mean, so I definitely hope to see, the eventual long-term opening towards, commerce state to state. We're thinking in the long term when it comes to that, especially when we're thinking about, automating resupply. That doesn't happen just within one state. So you can take, an entity like Apothecarium, who has locations in, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, as well as California. And once you're able to start manufacturing at a centralized hub, supplying different distribution depots and then resupplying your retailers via those, depots, you've really unlocked that automation across your own entities. So I'm excited and looking forward to, the evolution of that.
Do you think that there will be more companies with especially like dispensaries with multiple locations that will start, having their own distribution licenses to make that kind of movement more possible?
Yeah, a lot of them are, certainly, but at the same time, it depends on size. You look at California. When we first started in 2018 in California, which was a market that needed, that requires distribution. So not all markets do, or having that separate entity license. Most operators had a distribution license, and that was really for ease of move, like you were saying. And it was also, just because the industry really hadn't set up a really solid infrastructure for distribution, right? So there were no good distributors yet, really.
Right.
And so I think I'm definitely in the last, let's say 6 to 12 months, starting to see a shift towards larger distributors, because the economies of scale just make much more sense in having your own vehicles and insurance and technology platforms and all of that. So, I mean, I do think in markets that it makes sense for, we're going to move much more towards actually more centralized distribution, likely to mirror some of the other industries out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's wise and it's efficient.
Yeah.
We're almost at the end of our time, and I wanted to give you a chance to, if there's something that we haven't talked about that you wanted to bring up today. Is there anything at all?
Not really. I think we kind of talked about, the main thing that at least we're focused on the supply chain side and going beyond, just seed to sale and GMP and operational compliance, but really thinking about how do we bring that level of automation, artificial intelligence, and the insights to just make it happen, right? That you can sit back and the connections between, and we make sure that, operators know when they need to make more of something based on those trends and connecting that all out. So if anyone's interested in learning more about that, definitely look into Roshi, because we don't see anybody solving that problem right now.
And if people wanted to contact you or follow you on social media, how would they do that?
Yeah, so we're on Instagram as well as Facebook. Our Instagram is @Roshi Solutions, and that's the best place to connect with us, or our website. It's www.roshi.me.
Celia, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. It's really important that people are able to understand the process, because as you and I both know, it's a weird world out there in cannabis, and if you're approaching it, whether you're an operator or a consumer, it's confusing as to how things are figured out, the way our weird canna world works.
Yeah, exactly. We spent a lot of time, doing consulting as well, just on the side, sort of through our engagements, because it's all new, and we've, more and more people are entering the space.
Well, I want to thank you for getting us up to speed and into the new age of cannabis, where we'll be more organized, more grown up, and hopefully have better policies.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And for those of you out there who want to follow Planted on social media, our website is www.plantedwithsara.com. It is Planted with Sara on Instagram and Twitter, and it's Planted with Sara Pion on Facebook. Remember, Planted is 2 times a month, so tune in next time. We'll have another great guest. And until then, it's getting beautiful out. Enjoy the sun. Stay safe. Stay curious. And I will see you next time. Take care.